Welcome to the 700 Club. President Biden warned Israel that it risks losing global support if it continues to resist international pressure for a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Netanyahu reminded our president that most Americans stand strong in support of the Jewish state.
Well, as the Islamic holy month of Ramadan approaches, Israel is bracing for increased tensions and more attacks. CBN Middle East correspondent Julie Stahl has more from Jerusalem.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was reportedly surprised by President Biden's comments that he hoped for a ceasefire agreement by next Monday. In a public video, he responded to the president's recent comments.
Since the start of the war, I've been leading a diplomatic campaign to block pressure designed to end the war prematurely and to secure strong support for Israel.
On Late Night with Seth Meyers earlier this week, Biden said a ceasefire is the first step towards a Palestinian state.
And so there's a process underway that I think if we get that temporary ceasefire, we're going to be able to move in a direction where we can change the dynamic and not have a two-state solution immediately, but a process to get to a two-state solution.
Biden also said Israel risks losing global support if it continues to resist international pressure. Netanyahu noted a recent poll that shows most Americans support the Jewish state.
Today, a Harvard CAPS Harris poll was published, which shows that 82% of the American public supports Israel, meaning that 4 out of 5 U.S. citizens support Israel and not Hamas. This will help us continue the campaign until total victory.
Hamas called talk of a ceasefire premature, but the administration continues to express hope for an extended pause in the fighting soon.
That would allow for several weeks, hopefully up to 6, where there would be no fighting, so that we can get all the hostages out, increase the flow of humanitarian assistance, but just as critically, get the fighting stopped so that there's no more civilian casualties and there's no more damage to civilian infrastructure.
Meanwhile, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant is warning that Hamas, with the backing of Iran and Hezbollah, wants to use the Muslim holy month of Ramadan to incite Muslims in Jerusalem and biblical Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, towards another attack on Israel.
The central plan of Hamas to take the event called Ramadan, with an emphasis on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and turn it into the second phase of their plan that began on the 7th of October. This is the central plan of Hamas. This is pumped up by Iran and Hezbollah.
Gallant says it's important to target the terrorists while keeping the Temple Mount open for all Muslims during Ramadan, which begins March 10th and runs through early April. In Gaza, the IDF struck 8 terror targets that launched rockets at the coastal city of Ashkelon last night, while Israeli warplanes struck Hezbollah targets in Lebanon in response to more attacks against northern Israel. Julie Stahl, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, this is a time to let your voice be heard because we're in a political season. At the Michigan primary, to get very granular with the results, there was a drive by the Arab community, the Muslim community in Michigan, to vote uncommitted in the Democrat primary. They achieved more than 100,000 votes uncommitted. And they were trying to send a very direct message to President Biden that if he didn't put pressure on Israel for a ceasefire and stop the campaign in Gaza, that they would withhold their vote from him in the upcoming election. If they were to do that, that means he would lose Michigan's 15 electoral votes. That's a big deal in presidential politics, and they're very definitely trying to get the president's attention. For us who support Israel and view that Hamas has overstepped every line here, they have completely violated international law. They are the government of Gaza, and the international pressure should be put on them. Release the hostages, unconditionally surrender, lay down all of your arms, turn Gaza over so that these tunnels, all of this network of rockets and attacks against Israel can be completely dismantled. Until that time, Israel should continue to put the pressure on Gaza. This should continue. We should obviously pray for the protection of innocent civilians. There needs to be a way for them to be evacuated. That pressure should be put on Egypt and Jordan. These things have to happen in the international stage, international community. But most importantly, the pressure has to happen at our own Congress, with your senator, with your Congress representative, your representative for your congressional district, and then at the administration, that America stands with Israel in this. It's a very clear line. What Hamas has done cannot stand. Hamas needs to be eliminated as the government of Gaza. In other news, congressional leaders are optimistic they'll avoid a government shutdown. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That's right, Gordon. After their Tuesday White House meeting, House Speaker Mike Johnson and Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer sounded a positive tone about passing legislation in time to fund the government. In the background, though, is the growing debate over the southern border. CBN Capitol Hill correspondent Matt Galka explains.
Both President Biden and former President Donald Trump will be at border towns in Texas on Thursday, and fixing the southern border is at the center of discussions between lawmakers and the president while they try to avoid a government shutdown. The top 4 Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate met with the president to hash out differences over a looming government shutdown. A partial shutdown hitting agriculture, energy, veterans affairs, transportation, and housing and urban development could happen Friday, with the remaining departments impacted next week. The high-level meetings also focused on foreign aid, including money for Ukraine and Israel, as well as the southern border.
We must take care of America's needs first. When you talk about America's needs, you have to talk first about our open border.
A bipartisan Senate border bill collapsed after the House Speaker made it clear he would not support the bill in his chamber.
We all agree that we have a broken immigration system and there is a need to address the challenges at the border in a thoughtful, bipartisan way.
Illegal immigration has already become a central theme of the 2024 election. Biden will make a rare southern border visit this week, on the same day former President Donald Trump will be at a different border town.
You look outside and you see all of the horror. You see millions and millions of people coming across the border illegally.
Prolonged government shutdown could further stall any border action in Congress.
The first priority of the country is our border and making sure it's secure. I believe the president can take executive authority right now today to change that. And I told him that again today in person, as I've said to him many times, publicly and privately over the last several weeks. It's time for action. It is a catastrophe, and it must stop.
Could you do border just by administrative action? I think Biden won that argument because he said you can't do it, we all said, without personnel. And you need legislation for personnel. And even the Republicans in the budget asked for more money for personnel at the border.
To further emphasize just how important of an issue the southern border is in America right now, a new Gallup poll released shows a majority of Americans say immigration is the top problem the country is facing. It's the first time immigration topped the list since 2019. Matt Gelka, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Matt. Well, the two presidents aren't the only big names heading to Texas. Franklin Graham will preach in Eagle Pass tonight as part of an evangelistic tour along the southern border. Graham says he's not talking politics, rather sharing the good news with a region that's hurting. Pastors in the city told CBN's Heather Sells it's an answer to prayer. Here's her report from Eagle Pass.
This evangelistic tour focuses on 10 border cities, including right here in Eagle Pass, one of the hot spots over the last several years. Franklin Graham told CBN News that God has placed a burden on his heart for this region and that he intends to preach the good news to everyone, regardless of whether they're from the U.S., Mexico, or another country. The tour started in Brownsville, Texas, and will finish along the border in California. Pastors here in Eagle Pass say people here are struggling and they are praying for an abundant harvest.
As believers, as we're praying and asking God for revival, we are seeing that shift in the atmosphere. We are seeing things change and move.
This is something that God is doing supernaturally, And he's bringing people to revival. He's bringing people back to Christ. And we're living in an amazing time right now. It's phenomenal that you see this whole thing culminating right here, right now in Eagle Pass, Texas.
Pastors and lay leaders here have been preparing for this event for months and say they are ready to follow up with anyone who makes a decision for Christ. Reporting in Eagle Pass, Texas, Heather Sells, CBN News.
Thank you, Heather. Well, turning now to the national debate sparked by the Alabama Supreme Court ruling that frozen embryos are people worthy of legal protection. Some clinics in the state have halted in vitro fertilization treatments for fear of repercussions if something goes wrong. As CBN's Wendy Griffith reports, the issue is also dividing pro-lifers.
Illinois Senator Tammy Duckworth, an IV parent herself, is pushing legislation that would protect access to IVF and other fertility treatments. She says the potential fallout from Alabama's ruling could be devastating for both medical providers and potential parents.
IVF providers around the state and Alabama have already paused treatment out of fear that their doctors and patients could be criminally punished.
The issue is raising questions, especially among Republican lawmakers, many of whom have distanced themselves from the Alabama ruling. Some pro-lifers say that IVF is not wrong, it simply needs to be more ethical.
If you're going to do IVF, you can't create a whole bunch of embryos and then destroy the ones that you don't want. That is not ethical, and that is not pro-life. If you're willing to do IVF and you feel like the Lord has led you there for your family, you need to be willing, and doctors need to be protective of those little embryos that we create.
Alabama's Attorney General says he has no intention of prosecuting IVF families or providers. Republican Governor Kay Ivey says Alabama supports a culture of life, including helping potential parents access IVF. She's working with the legislature on a law that says embryos are not viable unless implanted in a uterus. The decision has caused uncertainty for many.
I still have one embryo remaining after, like I said, multiple retrievals, and I don't know if my family is complete at this point. So right now I'm in very much limbo.
Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra met with families affected by the decision.
We're trying to figure out at the federal level what we can continue to do to try to be supportive.
The ruling also propelled the issue into the presidential campaign conversation. Former President Donald Trump vowing to protect access to fertility care.
I strongly support the availability of IVF for couples who are trying to have a precious little beautiful baby.
Alabama's biggest hospital, one of 3 clinics stopping IVF, says it cannot commit to restarting treatments until the state Supreme Court reconsiders its opinion or legislation is passed. Wendy Griffith, CBN News.
All right, thank you, Wendy. Gordon, back over to you.
Well, this is obviously a very thorny issue for not just the pro-life community, but for the entire country. The reality of in vitro is that you have to produce multiple embryos in order to have a viable pregnancy. And in that production of multiple embryos, what do you do with them? Right now, they're put into deep freeze and kept in hopes that if the embryo that's implanted in a mother doesn't take, there's backup. And all of that is needed because of the sheer cost of doing the procedure. If you get into a legal framework where a hospital or a clinic faces criminal liability for those embryos, you're into literally stopping it. And that, I think, is the wrong way to go. If you stop down in vitro, you're stopping couples from having children. And that is something that we need to always protect, that couples should have the absolute right to have children and have as many as they want. But what happens just technically to those embryos that aren't used? Is the law going to say that you have to keep them frozen for all eternity? What does that really mean, and how do you get to that point? You know, in the Torah, there's this wonderful story of Tamar. It's always puzzled me. that at the end of it, she gets impregnated by her father-in-law after posing as a prostitute on the side of the road. And at the end of it, she's declared to be the most righteous of all of them. You know, two of her brothers-in-law died because they didn't impregnate her. And the result of it all is a declaration that she was more righteous than all of them. And the reason is she wanted to keep the family line going. And in that, you see descendants. You see King David coming from this. You see the Messiah coming from this. God's interest is in perpetuating the generations, and we need to keep that in mind. This is the righteous thing to do.